come all to a beautiful show. It's gonna be awesome and some other stuff. Dee-dee-dee-dee-doo-dee-dee-doo-dee-dee-doo-dee. Some other musical stuff.
This is Special Session for Thursday, November 21st, 2024. I'm Brian Schott, Managing Editor of Utah Political Watch. This week on the show, we'll run down the most important and interesting Utah political news from the last week, including the late-breaking news that Matt Gaetz is out of the running for Attorney General and what that could mean for Senator Mike Lee. Also, will a third-party candidate ever win an election in Utah? We'll chat with Michelle Quist. She was the United Utah Party candidate for Attorney General in this last election, and she has some thoughts. Plus, I answer your questions from social media. Before we get to all that, remember to subscribe to the program wherever you get your podcasts. If you leave a rating and review, that helps more people find the show, and I would greatly appreciate that. Also, if you want to stay on top of what's happening in Utah politics, sign up for my newsletter at utahpoliticalwatch.news. It's free, but you could also become a paying subscriber to help support my work and make more articles, journalism, and podcasts like this possible. All right, now that all of that housekeeping is out of the way, let's get to what you know and I know you're really here for, and that's a big ol' heapin' helpin' of the news. Just a little bit of behind the scenes. This is the third time that I've had to record this because news is breaking all over the place. As you probably know, former Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz has withdrawn as the Attorney General nominee in the Trump administration. There were a number of scandals swirling around him. The House was holding back on a ethics report that allegedly had details of him having sex with underage girls and paying for sex and participating in drug-fueled orgies, so he withdrew his nomination. There was some reporting in the New York Times that there were 4 senators who were at least skeptical enough of Gaetz's nomination as Attorney General that it would have put his confirmation in jeopardy, and those included incoming Senator John Curtis, who will be sworn into the Senate in January. And that is one of the reasons that Gaetz told confidants that he was withdrawing his name from consideration, because he did not want to get into a protracted confirmation battle and delay Trump from getting his nominations in. I reached out to Curtis's team about this earlier, and I got a statement from them that said, Senator-elect Curtis believes that every president is afforded a degree of deference to select his team and make nominations. He also believes in and is committed to the Senate's critical role to confirm or reject nominations based on information and insight from confirmation hearings. Curtis takes his constitutional duty to provide advice and consent seriously, and his goal is to ensure that Utahns' voices are heard. He plans to carefully examine the records of every nominee President-elect Trump sends to the Senate. Matt Gaetz is out. There's reporting that Curtis was at least skeptical enough of Gaetz that he would be one of 4 Republicans who could have sunk his nomination, because Republicans only have 53 people in the Senate. So if you drop 4 of them, that means you no longer have the votes. In response, Donald Trump has, within the last 20 minutes of me recording this, nominated former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi as his new pick. There was some speculation that Senator Mike Lee might be the pick after Gaetz dropped out. I don't know how serious those discussions were. I do know that he was on the short list the first time around, but as we all know, Trump is completely unpredictable, and he went with Matt Gaetz, who was on nobody's radar at the time. Mike Lee was thought to be one of the front runners. I don't know if he was this time or not, but Donald Trump quickly picked Pam Bondi as a replacement for Gaetz. So what we know for sure is that Mike Lee will not be the next Attorney General. He will remain in the Senate. He's probably still eyeing a Supreme Court seat, which is the job he really wants. I don't know if he'll be up for any other jobs in the administration or even offered any jobs in the administration. I don't even know if he was offered the Attorney General's job, but I know that he was on the short list. And John Curtis is probably going to get a lot of backlash from, at least from the more conservative Utah Republicans, because of the reporting that he was skeptical enough of the Matt Gaetz nomination that he was one of 4 Republicans who caused him to withdraw his name from consideration. This is probably the most important story from the last week, and it has to do with the Great Salt Lake. Lawmakers heard this week that the Great Salt Lake has dropped down to the level we last saw in 2021, which is 4,192 feet. That's just above the lowest level ever recorded, which was in 2022, which is 4,188 and a half feet. And this is really alarming because at the same time, Ben Winslow over at Fox 13 was reporting that more of the state is starting to slip into drought conditions. We had a couple of good water years, a lot of precipitation over the last few years, but then it looks like things are starting to reverse themselves. Lawmakers had done a lot to address the Great Salt Lake over the past few years. They've spent over $1 billion on water conservation measures. So if you're looking at what's happening right now and then think about, well, didn't they just do a lot to encourage conservation? That stuff is just starting to come online. So we're not really seeing the effects of it yet, but House Speaker Mike Schultz wants to put a pause. But it looks like things are starting to go south again. This is alarming because as the Great Salt Lake dries up, the possibility of toxic dust storms increases. There's arsenic in the lake bed and other chemicals. As the lake dries up, we'll see snowpack go down because the lake draws in storms that then feed the mountains, and that is the lifeblood of the ski industry here. Agriculture, livestock, health in general, those are some of the risks that are posed as the Great Salt Lake dries up, and it looks like that's happening again. We had a very hot summer, 80 degrees in October here in Salt Lake City, which I don't know if you've been alive as long as I have, but that's not normal. That is not a normal thing. One of the things that lawmakers are thinking about doing is changing the way that the state pays for water. A lot of the money that we pay for water is tied to property taxes, and Utah has some of the lowest water rates in the country. And one of the things that they're considering doing is making a tiered rate structure based on use. They want to monitor the secondary water that people are using. One of the things they're really not talking about, though, is just how much water goes to agricultural uses, specifically alfalfa. If you'll remember, alfalfa uses a lot of water, and Governor Spencer Cox is an alfalfa farmer. When I've asked him about that in the past, he pushed back pretty hard, saying that that is not the main reason that this is happening. But, alfalfa is not supposed to grow here, and it needs a lot of water. If you'll remember, back in 2021, Governor Cox asked Utahns to pray for moisture. He was roundly mocked for doing that. HBO's John Oliver spent a segment mocking him for that. And then when it started to rain, Cox essentially took a victory lap, taking credit for the moisture that started to come in and as the state started to slip out of drought. Now that it seems to have reversed itself, I think it's a legitimate question as to whether people have stopped praying for moisture and whether they need to start again. When we have elections here in Utah, people spend a lot of time analyzing how much money the federal candidates spend, the statewide candidates spend, but there's not a lot of attention paid on how much it costs to run for the Utah legislature. So I spent some time breaking down the spending reports for the 89 legislative races that were on the ballot this year, 75 in the House, those are up every 2 years, and then 14 races in the Senate. Overall, candidates for the legislature spent $5.8 million this year running for those 89 seats. The average race cost around $65,000 in total. That's all of the candidates. And the winning candidate on average spent around $40,000. A number of races had higher price tags than that. There were 19 races in all that cost more than $100,000 this year. There were 5 of those that went over the $200,000 mark, and one of them was over $300,000. The most expensive race this year was in House District 42. 4 Republicans and 1 Democrat jumped into that race to replace Representative Robert Spendlove, who did not run for another term. Overall, those 5 candidates spent just over $300,000 on the race. Republican Clint Okerlund was the winner. He spent $61,000 on the race, but his Democratic opponent, Travis Smith, put in over $100,000. In fact, one of the biggest contributors to the overall cost of the race was the three-way Republican primary this year. Michael Marker, one of the Republicans in that primary, he spent $91,000 on that effort, and Chad Westover, the other Republican who made it to the primary, spent about $38,000. There was one other Republican, but he was eliminated at convention, and he spent only a couple $1,000s on the race. The most expensive race that did not involve a primary this year was in House District 10 in the Ogden area. That was a rematch of the same two candidates from 2022. Democrat Rosemary Lesser was the incumbent, and she was once again challenged by Republican Jill Coford. Those two candidates together spent about $290,000 on that contest. Again, there was no primary. 2 years ago, Lesser won by 500 votes. This time around, Coford flipped the seat by about 300 votes or so. The most expensive race in the Utah Senate was in Senate District 15. That was won by Democrat Kathleen Reeby. She wins another term in office, but she only spent $38,000 to win. Most of the cost from that race, which carried a price tag of $243,000, were the three Republicans who got in the race trying to flip the seat away from her. Those three Republicans spent $195,000 on the race. Scott Cuthbertson, who won the three-way primary, he spent $92,000. Amber Schill, who lost that primary, spent over $102,000. And then Steve A spent about $5,000 on the race. Some of the other numbers, I won't belabor it here. There were 6 winning candidates who spent more than $100,000 on their campaign. Democrat Karen Kwan spent the most at $166,000. Don Ipson in House District 29 spent about $142,000. We already talked about Joe Coford. Republican Mike Schultz, Speaker of the House Mike Schultz, he spent $133,000, and we'll come back to that in a second. Republican Lincoln Fillmore spent $130,000, and Republican Wayne Harper spent about $103,000. Now, Ipson, he had to fend off a primary challenge from Chad Benyon, a former lawmaker, and that drove that price up. Harper had a strong primary opponent from state school board member Christina Bogus, and then he was challenged by independent candidate Monica Manuel, and she actually raised and spent over $100,000 on the race. So that's why Harper had to spend $104,000. Those were really the only competitive races where the winners spent big. If you look at some of the other races, Kwan outspent Republican State Representative Judy Weeks-Roner, who was trying to move up after one term in the House. She outspent Roner by 20-1 in that race. Schultz's spending was not because of a competitive race. He had a challenger at convention. He won that easily, and then he overwhelmed the Democratic candidate. But Schultz, in fact, he actually outspent the Democrat by more than 312-1 in that race. Most of his money was spent on consultants and donating to other candidates, other Republican candidates around the state. There were 5 candidates who spent more than $100,000 in a losing effort. We already spoke about Democrat Rosemary Lesser. Democrat Stacey Bernal in Senate District 3, she lost to Republican John Johnson. She spent about $125,000. Talked about Monica Manuel, the independent candidate against Wayne Harper, $103,000 in spending. Republican Amber Schultz, talked about that in Senate District 16, $102,000. And Travis Smith, the Democrat in HD 42, with $102,000. The candidate who spent the least, well, that was Republican Joseph Ellison. He was unopposed this year down in southern Utah. He spent just $1,085 on the race. We had interim this week on the Utah's Capitol Hill, and lawmakers are already gearing up to try and make some changes to the state's election system. We saw a bill that came out of an interim committee on Wednesday that targeted something that happened this last election. Utah County Clerk Aaron Davidson, who is one of the biggest election deniers to hold public office in the state, he admitted that he took a look at the ballots from elected officials to see how they returned their mail-in ballots. Did they pay for a stamp, or did they use a drop box? A bill that came out of interim committee on Wednesday would make that a no-no and result in jail time. That same interim committee rejected a bill from Representative Norm Thurston that would make it so any mail-in ballots that come in after Election Day would not be counted. Right now, a ballot has to be postmarked before the election, and then it can be counted as it comes in, and ballots do trickle in for a couple of weeks after the election. You'll see people yelling about, why is Utah still counting? They're still counting because it takes a while for the mail to come in some places. That bill was rejected by the committee. Expect Thurston to bring that back during the session next year. He tried it last year and it didn't go anywhere. There are a number of other bills that take aim at election laws, some of them to restrict mail-in voting coming in the next session. Representative Ryan Wilcox will once again have his bill that looks to take away the responsibilities of overseeing elections from the lieutenant governor's office. He was going to run that bill last year, and then he pulled it after Governor Spencer Cox asked him to not run it, but it's coming back this year. Accusations that there was a conflict of interest came mostly from Phil Lyman this last election, and he's kind of got a point. Right now, it's the lieutenant governor's office who oversees the elections, and Lieutenant Governor Deidre Henderson was on the ballot. Now, they said they were going to farm out any complaints to an independent person. It was former Lieutenant Governor Greg Bell. That same thing happened in 2020 when then Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox was on the ballot to run for governor. But, you know, it's not a good look. Utah and one other state are the only states that have the elections overseen by the lieutenant governor, someone who's on the ballot. And Wilcox's bill would probably address that and take that away. Then there are other bills coming that look to restrict vote by mail. We have one from Representative Trevor Lee, R. Dunning-Kruger, and what he is trying to do is he wants to disrupt vote by mail. You would have to request a mail-in ballot. It wouldn't be universal. Right now, everybody who's registered to vote in Utah is sent a ballot. He wants to make it so you would have to request a ballot. Then Representative Kara Birkeland, she wants to limit the number of people who receive a ballot to those who voted in either the last 2 or the last 4 elections. So a lot of these restrictions on vote by mail are driven by conspiracy theories that really haven't been proven. But those conspiracy theories are out there, and these elected officials choose to believe them rather than doing some digging, and you really have to wonder what their news diet is, because some of the stuff that they come up with, especially surrounding elections, is just wild. You can also expect another assault on the ability of candidates to gather signatures to appear on the ballot. That's known as SB 54. If we didn't have the signature gathering route, the Republican nominee this year would have been Phil Lyman rather than Spencer Cox. Spencer Cox would have been on the ballot in 2020 because he won the GOP convention that year, but Phil Lyman won enough to secure the nomination outright at convention, but Spencer Cox had gathered signatures and he was able to advance to the primary where he won. Delegates, mostly Republican delegates, don't like that that's been taken out of their hands, and if you know anything about Utah politics, you know that Republican delegates here in Utah to lean towards the more fringy political views, and they don't like the fact that candidates can now bypass them and get onto the primary ballot. Lawmakers have tried to get rid of the signature path before. There was a bill last year, and it's probably going to come back this year from Representative Jordan Tusher, where it basically says if any candidate gets 70% at a convention vote, then anybody who gathered signatures would not advance to the primary. And they're trying to figure out how to get more people to participate in the conventions and give delegates more of a say. But if you remember the caucus meetings this year for the Republican Party, they were an absolute disaster. In fact, only about 9% of the registered Republicans around the state showed up for those meetings. So the convention incentivizes people who are the most engaged, but also the most politically extreme. And then you get lawmakers who reflect that if you were to take the signature path away. If lawmakers do repeal SB 54, it's not clear whether Governor Spencer Cox would sign or veto that bill. If they were able to get enough votes to repeal the bill, I'm not sure what he would do with it. In the past, he said he would not sign that bill, but he's not going to appear on the ballot again. He's already said this will be his last term, and you wonder what he would do in that case. If SB 54 is repealed, expect Count My Vote. That is the organization that was going to run an initiative back in 2014, which would have done away with the caucus and convention system altogether. The only reason SB 54 exists is because that ballot initiative was going to pass, and lawmakers wanted to save the caucus and convention system. So they made that compromise with Count My Vote, which created the dual path. If lawmakers do undo that compromise, if they do repeal SB 54, expect Count My Vote to launch a ballot initiative that would then get rid of the caucus and convention. They would have to gather signatures in a very short amount of time, and that would probably cost a lot of money, and lawmakers made it harder to gather signatures. Not sure if they would be able to get on the ballot, but that could lead to another showdown if lawmakers decide to do this in the next session. Joining me today on the show is Michelle Quist. She was the United Utah Party nominee for Attorney General in this last election. She got just over 7% of the vote. And we're going to talk today about some of the things that she learned during the last, during the election. Michelle, thank you so much for your time.
No problem. Good to be here.
Let's just start off with what was your biggest takeaway from this experience running for Attorney General as a third party candidate?
The biggest takeaway, I think, is that the message is still relevant. People understand that the office of the Attorney General shouldn't be political. Law enforcement, shouldn't be partisan. And that message resonated, obviously, with, over 100,000 people in the state. Also, I learned running as a third party is hard. I think I knew that going in. I knew it would be an uphill battle. And so I guess I didn't learn that because I already knew that would be the case. It was a good experience, but the message resonated, and sometimes you have to do the hard things in order to carry the message. And the conversation wasn't being had, and it wasn't a message campaign. That's not what I'm saying. I had to run as a third party candidate, because the point of the campaign was to bring a nonpartisan option to the office. And that was the only way to do it.
One of the things that you focused on during this campaign was the fact that the last 3 attorneys general that we've have had a lot of scandal in their office. When Mark Shurtleff was elected in 2000, there was a lot of scandal swirling around him. John Swallow was an absolute disaster. He lasted about a year in the office before he had to leave. And then Sean Reyes has been a scandal magnet. And you were highlighting the fact that, this is what happens when, you have one party controlling it, and you were trying to take the partisanship out of it. But it felt to me like there was a lot of frustration on your part, because it's very hard to break through when people are so used to voting for the Republican on the ticket. It's almost reflexive, but it's also that way for the Democrat as well. And don't worry, we're going to talk about Rudy Batista in just a moment. But I'm curious about I'd like you to talk about your frustration that you had.
Yeah, I mean, my point was if we keep doing the same things, we're going to get the same result in this office. And nobody wants continued scandal in this office. And so I was trying to introduce a new way into this office. But because Sean wasn't running again, I don't think there was a lot of interest in this office, really. It wasn't in the media every day. We were talking about Phil Lyman and writing, and we were talking about ballot signatures. We were talking about Trump and the national elections. We weren't talking about Utah Attorney General because all of that had already been, kind of glossed over with the fact that Sean wasn't running again. And so I think the voters felt a little bit at ease with the idea that we were going to start over. And it is very comfortable to just kind of stay in your lane and vote for the party that you're familiar with.
I think that's a very good point. And I mean, was it your plan to try and run against? This is kind of putting it very simplistically, but was your plan to run against Sean Reyes because those were the problems in the office, and it's very hard to get people to focus on someone who's leaving?
I never had that plan. No, absolutely not. No, I was frustrated in the fall and in late fall, honestly, with the pick. I was with the anointed succession of who was chosen, and the fact that there was a chosen and that it wasn't kind of an open primary process. I was frustrated with the fact that the former governor who chose Sean started this investigatory committee and chose someone. He chose the last guy, and it didn't go very well. Why does he get to choose the next guy? I was frustrated that the person chosen wasn't a working attorney, and I was just frustrated with the fact that we were just doing business as usual with another Republican who, in an office of Republicans who weren't doing good in the office.
Speaking of Derek Brown, who won the election, you brought up a number of things that it felt like it was really hard to get people either to latch onto or and I can say, as a member of the media, there's a lot of attention that's divided among a number of things, but I mean, Brown he's a lobbyist. That's what he's doing up until this point. And he was a lobbyist for the social media companies who the state is suing over, for a number of issues. And there were some conflicts there. And it seems like it was very hard to get not only the public, but the media to really latch onto that, because those are hard things to explain. And people have very, very short attention spans.
Yeah, it is a bit legal minutia, of legal ethics and conflicts, and it's easy to say, well, we'll put up an ethical wall. Well, then you can't talk about your experience, which is what you're doing. It was hard to put those to get attention on those issues and the race in general. Like I said earlier, it just didn't seem to be, because I think there just was this anointed successor, and people, in a one party state, it's easy to think, well, we have the winner after the May and then the June, after the June primary, we have a winner. It's kind of over. We don't need to pay attention to it anymore. And I think that's a disservice to Utahns.
And there were some things that probably didn't help you out very much as well. And I'm really going to point at the one televised debate. It did not help your case that there were 4 candidates. It helped Derek Brown a lot that there were 4 candidates on the stage. It really, I've got my problems with the Utah Debate Commission, and I think it's probably time that we ditch it because it doesn't really do what it's supposed to do. And maybe I'll talk about that sometime later. But that was just one of the structural things working against you, because you've got the Republican who's the front runner in the race. You've got a Democrat who's not really seriously campaigning at all. In fact, he got the Democratic nomination, but then spend all of his time trashing the Democratic Party. You've got Andrew McCulloch, who's run in every attorney general's race.
He says, I'm just glad to be here.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really hard to make your case when that's a big advantage for the front runner to have three other candidates on the race deflecting fire from him.
And the Tribune didn't even show up to that debate. They were absent. They didn't report on it. They weren't there that night. They didn't do any stories afterwards. And so it was as if it barely happened to all of the people who follow the Tribune. My goal, I had three goals in my campaign. And the first was to get on the debate stage, because with limited funds, that was my way to reach a wider audience. And to limit my audience by not being there as one of the major media sources was a huge disadvantage.
Talk about your frustration with Rudy Batista. His apparently didn't spend any money other than his filing fee. And he didn't say where that money came from, which you kind of have to report. But it just seems like there's just really no incentive to take a look at these things, because I certainly didn't see him doing much campaigning at all. But still, it felt like the Democrats just reflexively voted for the Democrat. He got about 28% of the vote.
Right. And that's what they do. People just stay in their lanes and vote for the parties that they're familiar with. He didn't campaign. He didn't disclose the filing fee or how he paid for it, which and the point there is that he wasn't following the campaign finance rules. He tried to wear that as a badge of honor. I'm not taking donations, and so I can be clear of conflicts, which would be great, except that you can still engage with voters and share your message. And if you don't, that means you don't have a message. And if you don't find, if your message is, I'm so free of conflicts that I'm not even accepting donations, then you have to find a different way to share that message. And, but he didn't, because he didn't really care to. He kind of knew he wouldn't win, and he's just kind of, filed in order to be a placeholder. He filed last time as the Libertarian, which, to each his own, but it hurt me. It hurt others who cared about making a difference in the state and wanted to actually hold the job and make a difference in the office. I don't know if he ever saw himself as Attorney General. I did, and I do, and I could make a big difference up there. And so, to put yourself on the ballot knowing that you're going to drag that big of a percentage just because you hold a D, especially if you announce on the debate stage that I'm not Democratic, I'm not a Democrat, I'm an independent, then don't file as the Democrat.
Do you think that this office should be elected at all? I mean, there've been talk about making it appointed, and there's been some hand wringing. I can see advantages both ways, but I'm curious.
I do. If it were ever to be appointed, I think that should have been done, 130 years ago in 1896 when we, wrote the Constitution. But right now, it's one of our only 5 executive officers. And because, with the way that our state is so solidly Republican, we have little separation of powers as it is. And I don't want to reduce that. I still want an opportunity for somebody to be elected and be independent of the legislature and the governor and fulfill that role and represent Utah and Utah's people in the court system independently if they're able to.
Do you think that a non-Republican or Democrat can win in this state? We saw Evan McMullin perform very well against Mike Lee in 2022. So there's hope. Do you think that we'll see someone who doesn't have an R or a D by their name win?
I think it's trending that way. We see nationally that voters are not, they're more prone to not register with a party. It's more than 50% now that are unaffiliated. It'll be a while. I think it'll be a while before somebody is able to bridge that gap.
Last thing I would like to ask you on this. News today that Matt Gaetz has withdrawn his name from the Attorney General's from consideration as Attorney General of the United States. And one of the names that's popping up is Senator Mike Lee. You were a longtime member of the Republican Party. Do you think that he would be a good pick?
I think that he should go and do that. That is all I will say.
And I think I'm picking up what you're putting down, so I will leave it there. Michelle Quist, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Nice to be here. Thanks so much.
Mailbag day, mailbag day. Hey everybody, it's mailbag day.
Once again, we got some good questions sent in by social media. Remember, you can follow me on Blue Sky or on Threads. I'm not using X or Twitter anymore. That's the bad place. Also on Facebook. You can find those links on the website, utahpoliticalwatch.news. All right, on to your questions. This first one comes from Sister for Resist on Threads, and they write, do you think John Curtis will honor and uphold the Constitution, or will he be like Mike Lee and bow to Trump? I've talked about this before in the past. I think that Curtis wants to get things done. He's going to the Senate not as an ideological warrior. Mike Lee has morphed into that. Well, he doesn't really morph into that. I guess that part of his personality has come out more and more over the years. Mike Lee did go in on the Tea Party wave in 2010, but Curtis, he's not that kind of politician. He's not a bomb thrower. He wants to get things done. I think he will look for opportunities to do things when it comes to questions about the Constitution and his loyalty to the Constitution. I think Curtis is a reasonable person, and he's going to understand when things are constitutional and when they're not constitutional. As we remember, Mike Lee, when Donald Trump was trying to overthrow or overturn his election loss in 2020, was trying to look for a constitutional underpinning to what he was trying to do. That's not the kind of person Curtis is. So I get the sense that that's the kind of politician he's going to be. He wants to get things done, and he will work within the bounds of the law. Rai Nielsen on Threads asks, would love to hear the actual implications of the latest state Supreme Court ruling on all the previous ballot initiatives that the legislature mutated. What they're talking about is the ruling by a district court and the state Supreme Court that the legislature overstepped its constitutional authority when they gutted Prop 4, which is the Independent Redistricting Commission. And if I'm reading the question correctly, it's what does this mean for the other ballot initiatives? It doesn't mean anything right now because there has not been a lawsuit challenging what the legislature did to those ballot initiatives. If you remember that there were 3 ballot initiatives passed in 2018. There was the Independent Redistricting Commission, and that one was gutted by the legislature, and that is the subject of the lawsuit by League of Women Voters Utah, Mormon Women for Ethical Government, and some other plaintiffs, and that is back in the hands of a district court who has yet to rule. The other ballot initiatives that were overturned, the other ballot initiatives that were overridden by the legislature, one was expanding Medicaid coverage. The legislature radically changed that, and then there was the legalization of medical cannabis. The legislature completely overhauled that. Nobody has challenged in courts what the legislature has done, so the disposition right now is nothing. What the legislature did stands. If someone wants to bring a legal challenge, I suppose that they could, but right now, what the legislature did to those ballot initiatives is what is standing right now. It's not going to overturn anything. There has to be a legal challenge in order for the court's ruling to apply to those other ballot initiatives. And that's it for this week. My thanks once again to Michelle Quist for joining the program. A little bit of a programming note here for you. I don't think we'll have an episode next week because of Thanksgiving. It's kind of hard to write and produce one of these things when you're fighting through a wicked tryptophan coma. But if something happens, I'll definitely bring you a new show. Remember to rate and review this podcast. Help new listeners find the show. You can do that on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And that just helps the algorithm suggest this program to more people. people. You can also sign up for my free newsletter at utahpoliticalwatch.news, or if you really like what I do, you can become a paying subscriber and support my work. That allows me to continue committing acts of journalism. It makes these podcasts possible. It makes my reporting possible. And you can do that for as little as $5 a month. If you have any feedback on the show or a suggestion of someone you'd like to hear or a topic you'd like to have me discuss, you can always reach out by email, social media. It's not hard to find me. All the links are on the website. Special Session with Brian Schott is written and produced by me, Brian Schott. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.